about liberty was the preeminence of moral equality. Liberty for all, by necessity, means that moral equality is more important than liberty. For moral equality guarantees, but cannot be guaranteed by liberty. Where liberty is worshipped and nature rules, the superior will subdue the inferior, whether by force or persuasion. Because of nature's indifference to the hopes of human morality, mere law cannot command the hierarchy nature prescribes. Where liberty is worshipped and nature rules, law will be undermined. Dread, he goes on, is a story of the violent undermining of law. The underlying assumption of dread is that the test of strength underlying the institution of slavery must sooner or later reverse its consequences. The existence of slavery affirms the absence of moral equality as the bond of the master class. And so we get a paradox here, which he continues on the next page of this chapter. Superior in goodness, if it is possible, seems to deny the basis of moral equality. It seems to raise a claim to command which both respects differences in men and distinguishes men radically. As if to emphasize this paradox, moral equality also cannot distinguish one people from another, as liberty may. A people dedicated to liberty is distinguished from a servile people. But a people affirming moral equality as the basis of their claim is not thereby distinguished from another people ignorant of that principle. That is, they claim no superiority vis-a-vis another people, even if they might be entitled to make such a claim, because the principle they affirm asserts a universal deficiency in human nature. Only as their attachment to moral equality leads to their enjoyment of liberty can they be said to live a relatively better life. The attachment to moral equality not only disallows radical distinctions among fellow citizens, it disallows radical distinctions among humankind. This is unbelievably profound. And I think at the heart of the difference between how Jefferson and his fellow founders viewed the principle of equality articulated in the Declaration of Independence as a self-evident truth, and what later comes to be called the self-evident lie of the Declaration. I think this is going to the heart of that. It is simply not self-evidently true that all men are created equal in capacity, in moral capacity even, unless one defines that in the way Bill has here. We're not, our intellectual faculties, our physical prowess, our height, all of these things are not. And for Jefferson to call it a self-evident truth requires this kind of understanding, Aristotelian understanding of the nature of human beings. What Professor Jaffa has pointed out, the difference between human beings and God on the one hand and beasts on the other. And once you get that basic proposition down, it is self-evidently true that all men are created equal. And the corollaries from that so beautifully flow in the Declaration, require the consent of the governed and make clear that a guarantee of republican forms of government consistent with those moral principles cannot tolerate slavery. We get there through Stowe, courtesy of Bill, and it is well worth the effort to make it.
All right. Fantastic. Okay, I guess we want to open it up for questions now, so let's open it up for questions. Okay, questions?
My name is Les Taylor. Is this true that Harriet Beecher Stowe actually met Abraham Lincoln, and his remark was, I paraphrase, "You're the lady that began all this conflict," or, it's a very loose paraphrase.
It is certainly true that Harriet Stowe's daughter, who accompanied her on her first visit to the president, records in her diary that the president greeted her with the statement, "So you're the little lady who caused this great war."
Go. Yes.
Yeah, just a couple of things. On this matter of sentiments, sentiments are really generalizations of the disposition of parents to love their own, things like this. They're true most of the time. The Soviet Union followed this particular political science, where it would have a convention of giving people the freedom to go abroad as long as members of the family stayed home, right? But some people defected, and so the children were left behind. I used to recall Woody Allen's line that this is a watch that my father, on his deathbed, sold me. So that, you know, these were at best sentiments, only generalizations, and they pointed to the principle. I just wanted, Al, just wanted to add a little touch the point you raised at the end, but didn't sort of held back from completing. When Lincoln was explaining about the Fugitive Slave Clause, and he said it was nominated in the bond. We wouldn't have had this union unless we were willing. That was part of the deal. We could block the importation of slaves from abroad. We could block the expansion within. But the other side was the Fugitive Slave Clause. But the Constitution is silent about the presumptions. Do we presume that any black man running free in the North is a runaway slave, and the burden falls to those who prove him free? Or do we presume that he's free and put the burden on those who claim him to be a slave? He presumes the latter, which is to say, he completes the reading of the Constitution by reading the Constitution in the light of the Declaration. He begins with the premise that all men are by nature free, and the burden is going to have to fall to those who would prove him to be a slave. So this is just the way of Lincoln completing the project. That once again, it's not to make that if you simply read the Constitution within its four corners, as they say, you come out with Tawney's reading. The black people are simply a servile population. If you read it against the Declaration, you have said, this is a compromise made by people who accepted the principle of the government by consent of the wrongness of slavery.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great way of crystallizing the role that Lincoln saw for sentiment, right? To try and have an anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution. I think what's interesting is there's a real line between Stowe and Lincoln, and I think that's a sort of the alternative vision she has of consideration for the enslaved person. A lot of important and very helpful comments in John's critique, and John, this is exactly the kind of stuff why I look to you for help on this. There are some I think points where Stowe is still setting up something that is I think distinct from a utilitarian view, right? Your first point is slaveholders have a vision of the law as we're going to keep people in slavery because that will promote overall the good of society. Perhaps we can look at this, and I think most people in this room would say, if we took a comprehensive view of the utility of slavery, it would be we would be anti-slavery. So there are ways in which I think the anti-slavery folks tried to put this within a utilitarian framework, but I don't think they cared whether it fit into a utilitarian framework, right? They, Stowe, and I think she's much further out on the sentimental side than Goodell or Emerson. Stowe wouldn't care whether or not it was overall good for society, right? That's the critique. It's the critique she sets up. I think you're exactly correct that there's a sentimental as well critique of law, and as well as a sort of deeper understanding. Goodell, Emerson have this, that this is something slavery should not be law, and they arrive at that for reasons perhaps in part sentimental, but for other reasons completely independent of sentiment, right? It's just sort of, we have a separate basis for concluding whether something's immoral. And other point that I think really another important critique you have is sentiment could be pro-slavery or anti-slavery, right? There are pro-slavery novels, sentimental novels that respond to Uncle Tom's Cabin. The sentiment could be pro-slavery, could be anti-slavery. Stowe has a particular basis for saying why it should be, a particular way of critiquing this from a sentimental standpoint. But I agree with you, absolutely, it can be pro-slavery. Many pro-slavery appeals are sentimental, yeah. it's a very, sentiment is incredibly slippery and depends on who's making it. Yeah, thanks.
May I speak to that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just briefly, I want to point out two factors. First of all, Harriet Stowe wrote 2 anti-slavery works before she published Uncle Tom's Cabin. They were 2 short essays. The first was the Franklin essay in 1837. The second was an essay called The Two Altars. And this was brought forward by the Fugitive Slave Law itself of 1850. The Two Altars was a brief narrative of the pursuit of a fugitive slave in Massachusetts, presumably. The 2 altars in the title, in the course of the drama, become clear as the altar of liberty and the altar of law. And she sets up the dichotomy very clearly between the altar of liberty and the altar of law, asking, where are we going to make our sacrifice? Or what are we going to defend? She concludes the essay when she names the altar of law by actually not naming it, having set up this contrast. She goes, the altar of ... where clearly what is meant is law. So that it is fair to say that Harriet Beecher Stowe was acutely aware of the distinction that we are now describing as a distinction between sentiment and law. But the sentiment didn't mean sentiment. I mean, John Eastman is right about this. Sentiment meant in that case liberty, but even there, as Uncle Tom's Cabin shows, it was liberty insufficiently defined. In Sunny Memories of Foreign Lands, therefore, the conversation is brought back to that. And remember that Stowe didn't simply write stories to try to accomplish her purpose. She was practically and actively engaged. The trip to England was a campaign trip. She was attacked by Ambassador Ingersoll and by the New York Times and others for, as the Times put it, spreading her country's dirty laundry abroad. This was a calculated political effort, engaging people like Cobden and Bright, whom we heard about last night, among many others, but more importantly, the evangelicals in England, to try to do something about the problem of slavery. At the heart of that, as she went to the campaign through England, was an attempt to make clear that what was at stake was to make the law itself clear, to overcome the tensions, the conflicts in the law, by persuading people to abandon those aspirations that were inconsistent with any healthy law. And so therefore the question becomes, how do you identify healthy law? So to go to Hadley Arkes's initial question again, it would be odd to say that there's a presumption in the Constitution or in the law that any black person walking around freely is to be presumed a slave. Odd not simply because of the reasons that Lincoln enunciated, but because the law doesn't treat any property that way. The law doesn't make presumptions about property. It makes presumptions about property owners who carry the burden always to establish their ownership or the pedigree of property. But property is never answerable to the law in its own right. So it wouldn't be possible to have a presumption that any free black is a runaway slave. I mean, that may be a sentiment, but it couldn't be law.
Let me add one thing to the discussion. Bill, in Chapter 2, talks about one of the critiques of Uncle Tom's Cabin is Francis Lieber's, the minister does not appear once. Right. And the bill goes on to explain, well, the ministers actually appear twice, taking opposite sides, that the Bible commands slavery and the Bible forbids slavery. And then Stowe then takes the discussion in a different direction since religion doesn't answer. But what I want to pose, and I think Stowe more deeply does pose, is does religion more deeply, as law more deeply, do give us the ability to answer that question? Or are we kind of subscribed, well, you know, I'm a lawyer, we hire experts, and I can hire an expert on any side of any issue. And I'm reminded years ago I did a debate about, you know, some Central American policy of the Reagan administration, and after my exposition, brilliant as it was, the other person said, well, those are your facts, and now here are our facts. You know, that's just not true. I mean, you know, one of us may have been misunderstood the facts. One of the ministers may have misunderstood the commands of religion, just as one of the expositors of law may misunderstand the deeper understanding of the law. And it's our job to get to the root of what those things actually are, if we believe such things are immutable. There are truths applicable to all people at all times. Modernity largely has rejected that. They're primarily the half dozen people in the country that share the view that are all in this room, that there are truths applicable to all men at all times.
More questions? Questions? Here. Radu?
Hi, Matthew Radu. My question is for Professor Brophy. As I understand it, right, the judges in the slave code cases, such as the one in North Carolina, were saying, look, whatever we might feel about slavery, this is the law, and we as judges are not free to change it.
Right.
Now, is there evidence about the same judges, were they engaging in kind of common law reasoning about other issues, right, where they said, yes, this is what the law says, but we have this great tradition of jurisprudence, and therefore we're going to tweak it in some cases. So, I mean, is there any evidence of intellectual dishonesty where they're saying, oh, we can't change the law in this case because this is what the law said, clearly written down, but in other cases, we're going to
We'll be more flexible or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or were they consistent
Right.
and just stuck to whatever text of the law they were dealing with, whether it was something as charged as slavery or whether it was something as mundane as a trespassing case?
Right.
Or something?
I mean, I think there's a series of issues here. One of them is you get pro-slavery judges like Ruffin saying, hey, whatever my feelings are in private, I have to abide this pro-slavery law. You also get anti-slavery judges who are in the North making those same kinds of statements, right? I'm opposed to rendition of fugitive slaves, but the law requires me to, so I will send, right? So you get people on both sides of this issue sort of appealing to the same sort of sense of formalism in law. I'd be interested in John and Bill's thoughts on this. I think part of this is it's an excuse that judges, it's an excuse rationale, right? This is the decision I want to render and I can't render a different decision. To some extent, though, I think there's pretty substantial constraints, and I think this goes to some stuff that both Chandra and Lucas were talking about this morning. Lincoln was just constrained, as much as he may have wanted to emancipate folks at his inauguration, but he didn't have the legal means to do so, right? And so I think that there are political as well as legal constraints on these judges.
Yeah, just a quick word that Stowe, who uses, of course, the Ruffin example in Dread, as Al pointed out, also speaks about it directly and not in a fictional way in the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it seems clear to me that she regards Judge Ruffin as anti-slavery rather than pro-slavery. And so that becomes an illustration of her two alters theory, that this is of someone who denies his sentiments on the basis of adherence to law, to legal process.
And I think it tells us more about the difference between Lincoln on the one hand and the abolitionists on the other. So I don't think it would be hypocrite. There are examples of the law evolving in contract or tort with the use of common law principles that the judges apply, and that they don't take that opportunity with respect to slavery. I don't think makes them hypocrites. I think it makes them realize that they're sitting on top of a powder keg. And, you know, if you change the risk assignment and liabilities in tort, it's not going to have the same kind of consequences as a change in the risk calculus in liability of slaves or slave owners in a slave case. And it's the same thing Lincoln talks about in the Lyceum Address. So, you know, I wouldn't think they're playing games here. They're confronting the same prudential problem that the founders confronted when they drafted the Constitution, that Lincoln continued to confront all the way up through the first inaugural and grappling with whether to issue an Emancipation Proclamation.
Just one last word on that. This is the reason I read the passage from George Washington at the outset. I think that really sets the tone for the whole conversation, because it was so explicit. He explicitly said, I want to see it abolished, but I cannot accept any method of abolishing it other than that which is compatible with republicanism. It was made explicit. There's no reason for or room for interpretation there.
Questions?
Colleen Sheehan, Villanova University.
I wouldn't have known.
We started a conversation yesterday that we only just began and didn't get very far into it. And that's the question of, well, it's the question you've been dealing with all during this session of positive law versus higher law or some kind of the moral claims upon humanity. And I'm not sure where sentiment would fit into that, but let me give you an example and ask you to apply what it is. How would Stowe answer this? I think I know that. I think the Lincoln question, how Lincoln would answer this, is more difficult. And then maybe you agree or disagree with one or the other. Fugitive slave clause, when it's got to be enforced. And it becomes clear, if you're anti-slavery, you live in the North, you have a legal obligation as a citizen that those slaves have to be, you have to at least advance that they're returned to their owner. But you believe that's absolutely the wrong thing to do morally. But the law commands you to do it. Gentlemen, what is the right thing to do in this circumstance? How would Stowe answer that? I think Stowe answers it pretty clearly with the example of Eliza, but you might disagree. And look, if you don't buy the Eliza case, little Harry. Would you send little Harry back? How would Lincoln answer it? And do you have a critique of either of those views?
Go ahead. Well, I'm not sure about Lincoln or Stowe, but I think Mark Twain answers it, or attempts to answer it, and he attempts to answer it in Huckleberry Finn, when, of course, Huck is placed in this moral dilemma because he's with this runaway slave who he has learned that this person has a humanity that of course he's never, that popular society says, of course, that he doesn't have a humanity, and so he's faced with this moral dilemma of whether he should turn in this person who he's learned, that he has his humanity, but the law says that that he should turn this in, and so Huck has the exact moral dilemma that you mentioned, right? And I think that by him not turning in Jim, the runaway slave, I think that Twain is trying to show that humanity overrides whatever the law might be. Now, perhaps they could talk more to Lincoln and Stowe, but I think that's exactly what your question is. Exactly what Finn is, what Twain is trying to accomplish in Huckleberry Finn.
I'm confident that Lincoln's public response to your question would consist in affirming the obligation to obey the law. I'm confident about that. It's a little harder to be confident about Stowe's public response, only because we don't find her acting in that capacity, so we don't have a lot to go on. We must really use extrapolation and surmise. If we judge from the novel, Senator Byrd and Mrs. Byrd, in the case of Eliza, we would say she seems to approve that the man who just voted for the law to return the slaves acts to free the slave. I.e., she seems to suggest that there are some overriding principles, or call it humanity if we will, but remembering that she redefines humanity in the course of the novel. This overriding sense of humanity must have a certain kind of priority over the law. But the question is it an anarchical priority? Is it a kind of Thoreauvian civil disobedience that Stowe is cultivating? Or is it rather a sense that those standards in accord with which we seek to reformulate the law must first be powerful enough to move us independently of the law before we can take them seriously? And we see this, of course, in the dramatic exchange between Augustine and Alfred St. Clair, the two slave-owning but contrasting brothers in New Orleans, who have a long discussion about the basis of slavery, with Alfred insisting it's merely the right of the stronger, and Augustine insisting rather that there's something fundamentally wrong with it. He thinks it probably has something to do with something like the Declaration of Independence. Ultimately, he believes he's bound by it, but he can't quite rise to the challenge to do anything about it. Can't quite rise to the challenge even to free his own slaves initially. Can't quite rise to the challenge to change the law. So what Stowe seeks to convey is opinion strongly enough held to require efforts at least to change the law, as opposed merely to disobeying the law. So let me just be really emphatic about this. I don't think Uncle Tom's Cabin is about lawlessness in any dimension. Remember that Frederick Douglass does, of course, change his mind, as we were told several times today, and ends up defending the Constitution as an anti-slavery document. But this is subsequent to his having an exchange with Harriet Beecher Stowe about that very question. In 1848, he gives the speech, "What Country Have I?" and rejects the Constitution. There is a key moment in Uncle Tom's Cabin where the very question, "What country have I?" is raised, which is a reflection of the dialogue she was having with Douglass in correspondence. And she responds, "Yes, you do have a country. Yes, the Constitution can be defended as anti-slavery." I would have to assume from that she would be reluctant merely to advise of breaking the law, even though we have to accept Tom's recognition when he tells both Eliza at the beginning of the novel and Cassie at the end of the novel to flee, because, as he puts it, "'tain't nature for you to stay." That nature is higher than the law, but they are not subject to the law. That's the key point. Senator Byrd was subject to the law. Eliza and Cassie are not subject. They were mistaken to believe they were subject to the law. And they were taught by Tom that they weren't subject to it, and therefore they could flee in spite of the law. So it seems to me she has charted a middle course.
Let me suggest that I think Lincoln charts a middle course as well. 10 years ago, on the 20th anniversary celebration of the Claremont Institute on Lincoln's Day, Clarence Thomas gave a speech about the virtue of practical wisdom in honor of Harry Jaffa. And the speech questions how he, a descendant of slaves, could be an advocate of the original understanding of the founding, or a devotee of Lincoln. And it was one thing to say we had to compromise with slavery for a short period of time to have a union that would ultimately put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. By 1860, it's a little harder to say that it's on a path to extinction. I mean, it looks like it's become a permanent fixture. Lincoln, however, made the same kind of prudential assessment and analysis that Madison and Washington had made 7 years earlier. And that led him to say, I can continue to compromise with slavery because of the prospect, the decent prospect that we can eliminate it. If that prospect had gone, then the right answer is not to adhere to an unjust law. And I think that it's to prudential judgment about whether we would had reached that point of no return that distinguished Lincoln from the abolitionists. Absent that, if we had reached the point of no return and Lincoln continues to adhere to the proposition that he has to enforce an unjust law, then that's immoral. But he made the prudential judgment, and I think history proves him to be right about this, that we had not reached that point.
Just
So,
one quick final word.
let me follow up on that real quickly, Bill. So, John, if that's Lincoln's position, and let me just make an assumption for a moment that you agree with it, maybe you don't. You do?
I do.
Okay. So you would return the fugitive slave?
Yep.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to tell a quick story. I said before the slaves were not bound by the law. I want to go beyond that. Fraudulent contracts are not binding, period. And therefore it is not breaking the law when one ignores the authority of a fraudulent contract. A quick personal story. On my father's side, my great-grandfather came to the United States shortly before the end of slavery. He freely immigrated to this country. He had been seduced by tales of the opportunity. The opportunity to which he responded was the opportunity to be a foreman in a large agricultural enterprise in southern Georgia. He arrived and found that he was a slave just like everybody else. Well, that was a fraudulent contract. The law would not defend that contract properly understood. If he were to run away, it would break the law to send him back.
Let me, because you ducked the hard moral question. So this reminds me of the story of you're a nice family in Nazi Germany, and you take a couple of fleeing Jews and hide them in your basement, and the Nazis show up at the door and say, "Do you have any Jews in the house?" And the question is, can you lie about that? And well, you know, to avoid the moral dilemma, you say, well, I know what they mean is, do you have any people that we ought to treat as subhumans in the house and send them off to the slaughter camps? The answer to that is no. But of course, that's not what they ask. And you've just avoided the moral dilemma, and I've done it very cleverly. But
as I say, fraudulent contract.
that's right. No, that's right. That's right. But if I carry that to its extreme, the initial capture in Africa of everyone, not just
my point.
as part of the that's right.
That's my point.
Okay. All right. Well, that's right. Then you are saying even Lincoln doesn't go on the right on that.
Right.
Yeah.
My name is Steve Leonard. Maybe you can speculate on this, maybe you can't. I have feelings about it, but would you have anything to say, any of you, about the Elian Gonzalez case, in view of Lincoln's dilemma here?
It's same that, yeah, no. Well, they were misapplying the law. See, in the way this is the point of the story about the Missouri and the Constitution protected slavery, but there were built into the Constitution propositions that, properly understood and enforced, would have limited its expansion. And this is Lincoln's point all along. And the same thing, the presumptions in the law actually cut the other direction in the Elian Gonzalez case, but they were not predisposed to try and find those presumptions to get to the best moral outcome in the case consistent with law they could. They actually were predisposed the other direction, and that's despicable. And what Bill's suggesting is on the Fugitive Slave Clause cases, by refusing to acknowledge other parts of the law, like fraudulent contracts, you are actually siding with pro-slavery when the law gave you a tool to do otherwise, and that's despicable. Yeah.
Well, on, did you want to say something else?
No.
I want to thank Larry for chairing this panel and all the panelists, and just a couple instructions about what's coming up next. Hope you'll all come back for our next session, which is at 2 o'clock, and I hope we're going to try to start promptly at 2, so if you want to sort of file in a little bit before that, which will be in the Villanova room, which is, you have to just go out and go around the corner. It's actually technically right there, but you go out and go around the corner. Prior to that, lunch will be served, and Sue, maybe you have the details where they're setting that up, and then I know the tables are in here.
The lunch will also be served.
Okay. So you're all invited, of course, to lunch, and I hope very much to see you at the 2 o'clock panel, which will be anything but dull or boring. Looking forward to it. Thanks.